never on good terms with the mic. Hi to everyone. It's my really great honor and pleasure to have today these really two incredible and inspiring authors with us and to talk with them about some pressing issues of our time, I would say. Let me just briefly introduce the two of them, although I think, in the meantime, there is no need for introduction. But as we are going to talk about some notions, some ideas that are around us today, I would want to somehow extract them also from the works that they published already. So Lea Ypi, or Ypi, is it Ypi? Okay. Lea Ypi is the Ralph Miliband Professor in Politics and Philosophy at LSE in London. And she's a fellow of the British Academy, the member of Academia Europaea, a fellow of the Albanian Academy of Science. I found that very important because you said yesterday that there were some troubles with the Albanian public, so I think now there's a reconciliation going on. And also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. You would all know that she is the famous author of Free, but I would want to say that at that very same year, she also published a book, The Architectonic of Reason, a book dealing with Kant's first critique. And she also has other books in that domain, that is political philosophy or philosophy proper, whatever that would be. So The Meaning of Partisanship, Global Justice and Avant-Garde Political Agency, Kant and Colonialism, and Migration and Political Theory, which is going to be important for us today. Indignity, the book published last year by Penguin as Free, is in the process of translation into Serbian, that is what I know, and by Geopoetika, as well as Slobodno odrastanje na kraju istorije. So all of us who read Free know something about Lea's parents, but I also want to say that Åsne Seierstad has equally interesting parents' history. I found the information in Wikipedia, so please, if I'm wrong, you will correct me. That there is a feminist author mother and a leftist politician father, which somehow reflects itself in her work. Seierstad is fluent in 5 languages and has a good working knowledge of another 4, which makes you a little bit of a Balkanite, I would say. I think that this is like something that we can find also in the Indignity. She's a freelance author and journalist, studied language and languages, Russian and Spanish, but as I said also yesterday, also history of ideas or history of philosophy. It appears in different ways. So I think that we have, in a way, 2 people who are philosophically minded with us. I also want to enumerate the books just for you to see where Åsne was, in a way, while doing this freelancing journalism and authorship. So she started, as we heard yesterday, in Serbia with, I think, the best title about the Serbs or Serbia, With Their Backs to the World, Portraits of Serbia. We have the book translated, but we somehow removed the first part of the title, and it's only Portreti Srbije. Then the bookseller of Kabul, 101 Days, a Baghdad Journal, Angel of Grozny, Inside Chechnya, One of Us, the story of Anders Breivik and the massacre in Norway, 2 sisters, a father, his daughter, and their journey in the Syrian jihad, The Afghans, 3 Lives Through War, Love and Revolt, and the last one, which is now being prepared for publishing in English, Never Say War, Life Inside Russia. And I found it very interesting that all of the books are published by Virago Press, which is like the first UK feminist press. I think that there is some hidden connection there. We have translated, as I said, Portreti Srbije, Knjižar iz Kabula i Jedno od nas. Probably now with the new publishers coming along, there's going to be the book on Russia, or at least I hope so. So what brings the two together apart from the mere fact that we had to do it this way, so 2 on 1? But I had read in the last week very, excitedly, but also in various ways moved, touched, even shaken, the 2 books, so Free and the book on Breivik, One of Us. And what I found there is like a very, very strong focus on people, and also a very kind and considerate one, but also making the readers ask themselves philosophical questions. Like, you know, why is all of this as it is? So in a way, Free, to me, even though it's a memoir and people read it that way, is primarily an essay about liberty, essay on liberty, which fuels us with various meanings on what it means to be free. I found at least 5, although I heard that there's 3 that are kind of the mainstays of the book. While one of us reads as some kind of modern trial of some kind of minor Eichmann, I would say. So reading these 2 books next to one another is also a reading about, I would say, 2 different Europes. Why? Because Lea, as we know, was born in 1979, as well as Anders Behring Breivik in the same year. And these are the growing ups of 2 people on different sides of Europe, but somehow really caught in a nutshell in these 2 books. So I would like to start with a question on Europe, and I stumbled upon a nice quotation to start this with from Stuart Hall, the British renowned cultural and media scholar, who in one place says, "Where does Europe begin and end? Has it always existed, and if not, when did it start? What is the new Europe's relation to its past? Which parts of Europe belong to the idea of Europe and which do not?" So in a way, Lea now witnessed in UK the 10 years of Brexit, the anniversary or commemoration, I don't know which, and there's 36 years of the fall of communism that we relate not just to Albania, but to the entire post-socialist part of Europe. Whereas Åsne is basically writing, if we exclude the Breivik book, basically writing from all other sides of the world, looking back to Europe in various ways. So, especially in Russia, which has its own idea of what Europe and European values, for example, are. So what is Europe today, and what does this name stand for? Maybe we start with Lea, and all the questions are basically for both of you.
Yeah, thank you. So I've thought a lot. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be in conversation with both of you and with the public. So I've actually thought a lot about this question because I'm always asked it, and I'm especially asked it when I go to events with Eurocrats who ask me about Albania and Albanian membership in the EU and Albanians' relationship to Europe, with some sense that there is something like European values and that Albanians have to show something about the fact that they also share these values or don't share these values. And I've tried to give a lot of definitions and thought a lot about what is Europe. And then I decided that actually the best response was to not give a definition, because I felt there was a kind of ideological operation that was going on in asking Albanians to define Europe for a European public. And I'm sure you'll probably be familiar with some of the things that I will say from Serbia as well, with the idea that there is a desirable or a nice or a good Europe that is embodied by European institutions, and that intellectuals from the margins of Europe need to show that they also share this and so on. And that I felt that the very question was kind of somehow came with assumptions that needed to be unpacked. And so actually the only definition that I decided to give on what is Europe was that it's a place where stuff happens. So this is an intentionally broad definition. It doesn't tell you anything about the borders of Europe, for example, where it is and what is the territory that is covered by this thing that we call Europe. It doesn't tell you anything whether the stuff that happens is good or bad, and it can be anything. And the fact that stuff happens is intentionally also dynamic, meaning that it's up to us what happens and in what direction it's taken. And the reason, and I'm really going to end this answer by saying how I got to this, was that I kept thinking about my childhood in Durrës in Albania, where I grew up. And I grew up in communism, and it was very isolated. Unlike Yugoslavia, we couldn't go out, we didn't travel outside Albania. But Durrës was a very old city. It's actually mentioned for the first time in the, well, not for the first time, but it's mentioned centrally in the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides as the oligarchy that actually started, the oligarchy of Epidamnus that started the Peloponnesian War. And then it has a kind of Roman life and then Venetian city and so on. So whenever I went out in Durrës and started walking, we did this thing called the Giro, the Passeggiata, or, the Spaziergang. You just kind of go out and walk because there's not a lot to do. I would go past Hellenian ruins, and then a Roman amphitheater, and then these Venetian wars, and then these Ottoman era buildings, and then these fascist era buildings, and then these communist Soviet inspired buildings. And whenever I was asked, what is Europe to you, and do Albanians deserve to be part of Europe, I kept thinking about this walk and thought it was kind of hard to stay out in the last 2,000 years. And it's not that we might have tried, but it was not possible. And so in that sense, as I say, I now reject this question of Europe as more than a place where stuff happens, because I feel that anything more you say runs the risk of enabling and encouraging a discourse that in its essentializing features is actually problematic, because it absolves one party, the EU or the European institutions or the Europeans as a kind of site of values, and then it inevitably brings the attention on the party that needs to somehow justify itself or excuse itself or show that it deserves, where in fact I think both the merits and the responsibilities for evil run both sides.
Well, in Norway, there's very often you hear the question, are we going to join Europe or not? And the reason is that many people talk about Europe as the European Union. And Norway being outside of the European Union, we've had two major votes, one in 1972, one in 1994. Both ended up no, for different reasons. Some people will say it's nationalism. We don't want to be, share, our wealth or values with Europe. Another side is more like, why can't we just run ourselves? Like, why do we need to go and ask Brussels? Why can't we run, that our municipalities, that our parliament being local democracy is very strong in Norway. I joined it myself. If you have a campaign, you can access your leaders because you know their faces and you know how they run. So that is another, but is that un-European? So that's a big discussion, like being a country outside of Europe. Outside of the European Union. And then you have the country that I worked in now, Russia. When I moved first time to Russia in 1990, it was still Soviet Union. 91 it became Russia. Moving then to Leningrad, that became St. Petersburg. As I was there, it's definitely feels like a Soviet, but Europe. And the geographical border of Europe goes through the Urals. But now the regime, or Putin's regime, is very much distancing itself from everything European. So there's this huge square. The middle of Moscow used to be called the Europe Square. It had the flag of the 48 nations of Europe, all taken down. It's now the Eurasia Square. So a lot of these institutions have changed name to Eurasia, so they don't even define themselves as a country, as a European country. So it's definitely not a geographical space, it's a value space, and maybe I should just join my friend Leah in saying that, it's a place where stuff happens. Yeah, I'll take that.
I think many will leave this place with that definition. Okay, so I'm sitting in my village house and I'm opening the book One of Us, and the first word we find in that book by Anders Breivik are Marxist, you will all die today. And the year is 2011, so I'm thinking, in Albania, but also in Serbia and all around the place, there are very few Marxists at the time. And unfortunately today, in 2026, we hear a lot about the extreme left, radical left, even radical Marxists, cultural Marxists. They're all around us. So my question to you is, who are the Marxists from 2011 till today?
Well, I can tell you about the way he uses the word. So for those who, just to remind the details. So Anders Breivik was radicalized on the internet at a time where the term cultural Marxist was his enemy. And that's basically the mainstream. He was pretending, that's a big question actually, who was his enemies? He's pretending it to be the Muslims. And I think the more I worked on his story, that was because that was the trade of the day. That was a good hateful object. And then the question is, why did he then attack this summer camp of young, blonde, 15-year-old Norwegians and kill them? Because as he said, if you have a leakage in your bathroom, you don't start mopping up until you stop the leakage. And the leakage, meaning the refugee, the Muslim refugees coming in, you need to stop the leakage by stopping the Labour Party, the Social Democratic Party that let them in. So this summer camp is a camp of young Labour Party members from 13 upwards to almost 20. So he decides to go on a killing spree there after placing a bomb first in the government area. So he also wants to knock out the government, which was the Labour government at the time. Goes to the island, and that's where the victims who survived told me how he was screaming, "I'll kill you all, Marxists." And then when he was apprehended that same evening by the police, they asked him, do you know how many you've killed? How many kids or youngsters you've killed? And he was like, they're not youngsters, they're vermin. They're Marxists, they're not people. So for him, that's just a term of you know, something alien and something extremist to justify his actions. And the numbers, so there were 8 people killed by the bomb. He was delayed, so he came after work time. Otherwise, there would have been a lot more people. But things happened on his way, so he was delayed, and then he killed by shooting 69 young people on that island.
Yeah, so I think where I come from, there aren't that many Marxists, actually. And for me, more than the question of who are the Marxists, the question that triggers me is, what is Marxism? And it's interesting because I've always refused to talk about Marxism, because one of the things that really annoyed me about the difference between the kind of the liberal tradition and the socialist tradition is that in the liberal tradition, no one asks like, who are the Hayekians, or who are the Lockeans, or who are the Millians? But somehow socialists are identified with a name and a person and a body of thought that is exclusively conducted to this one person. And for me, that reifies and ends up also undermining that tradition by reducing it to this one person, to this one book, to this one body of thought. And so this is why for me the interesting question is, what is Marxism? And that question has 2 very different answers in Europe, depending on whether you come from the East or from the West. And a lot of my work is actually situated in between those 2 traditions, because I noticed when I was starting to, I was hired at the LSE and they wanted me to teach Marxism. It was something called Marx and Marxism. And I said to them, but look, you have a course on the liberal idea of freedom. So why can't I teach the socialist idea of freedom rather than Marx and Marxism? And my bosses at the LSE said, no, but nobody would take that course. You know, this is much more marketable, so you need to teach Marx and Marxism. And when I started teaching this course, the one thing that I really realized was that in Western Europe, Marxism is a philosophy, and it's a kind of theoretical apparatus. It's the critique of capitalism. It's these ideas that are somehow connected to the Communist Manifesto, to the reception of that book, to the reception of this social democratic tradition, one way or another. But there is a sort of idealized sense of what is Marxism, and it's very much philosophy. And on the other hand, I noticed, at least in Albania, but also presenting my book around former communist countries, that actually Marxism there isn't just a philosophy, it's also history. And it's the lived experience and the daily life of a lot of people who were under government, a system of rules that directly thought of itself as inspired by this tradition and created institutions that ran lives on these traditions. And so it was the dilemma and the difficulty in teaching Marxism and talking about Marxism and trying to somehow think critically about this body of thought that I call socialism, is that there are people for whom this is just philosophy, and it's, you know, if it's a system of rules, if it's politics, it's the politics of some weird people out there that did stuff and failed and then made a big mess and now we have to go and fix it. Or on the other side, it's just life and the books are irrelevant because it's like, oh, but we tried this, it failed, it didn't work. And for me, the effort to think about socialism in the 21st century is really the effort to try and learn from these both experiences. On the one hand, the kind of theoretical apparatus and what it tells us about capitalism, what it tells us about the societies that we live under now, and what kind of elements of analysis that could be productive. But on the other hand, how to do that in a way that isn't just dismissive about life and history and that kind of lectures people about things that they actually do know because they have lived, and there are these institutions that were run following some of these principles, and that there is something to learn both from the successes and the failures of that experience. And so how to navigate that in a way that is not paternalistic or dismissive, and that, you know, when it's a failure of some backwards people somewhere, and when it's a success of ideas. And I feel this difficulty, this moving back and forth between the two, is the challenge for rethinking about socialism in the future.
When I was reading Free, I was thinking precisely about this kind of revision of history, which I think we all in post-socialist countries still live, and we are constantly returning to something else, some previous history before the history marked by Marxism and Marx. But what I really also found, for me, precisely maybe the most important aspect of your book is this kind of recognition of this moment, that the 1990s is the moment when you had to change vocabularies, that you have to remove all the ideals that were somehow guiding all the generations before. And there is this one beautiful sentence, or part of the sentence, people's revolution against ideas. So 1990s were, in a way, people's revolution against ideas. So my question to both of you, I mean, this is something found in Lea's book on Albania, but I find it totally applicable to Serbia as well. But then I was also thinking, now in line with the previous question, aren't we also living in some very strong way a kind of people revolution against ideas such as freedom, equality, and dignity as well, coming from the far right, or increasingly any rights today?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to think of it in those terms, because then you don't think of the ideology of the right as these kind of crazy outliers that have come up with these crazy things and that somehow the liberal elites don't recognize and don't resonate. I feel one of the difficulties in thinking about the right and the reception of the far right in mainstream circles is that there is a sense in which there's a lack of understanding of how some of these ideas around return to nationalism or exclusionary politics, of this anti-immigration, xenophobic sentiment, is the result of the failure of some of the mainstream liberal policies over the course of the 90s and the 2000s. And so there is a kind of post-Cold War momentum that is a liberal momentum, or rather the kind of third way centrist momentum, which organizes Europe and the world and reflects on globalization along the lines of this kind of end of history thesis, which is that there is no alternative, the market is the only thing out there, what we do is we just privatize, open the market, and then hope that it will deliver. And then the market, in 2008, we can see how that whole process comes to an end with the financial crisis, and the results of the financial crisis are perceived everywhere in the world, in Europe, in Western Europe, Eastern Europe, in the United States of America. And I think the far-right backlash is in part a response to this technocratic politics and an effort to recover agency where there is a gap from the radical left or from the critique of globalization from a more progressive perspective. And so this opens the way to and enables a more right-wing critique. So what are the ideas? I mean, of course, in some ways they are universal ideas, because I think part of the core message of the right is to say, let's return to tradition, let's return to history, let's have this kind of nostalgic recovery of our organic community and so on. But of course they also themselves know that this is a myth, because there was never a time where you had these organic communities guided by tradition. There was never a time where politics were not exclusionary of some group or other, even if you go back to some ideal of, I don't know, 15th century Albania or 14th century Serbia or whatever, you know that this is constructed, you know it's artificial, you know the boundaries weren't where they are now, you know the institutions were not inclusive in any way because there were a lot of people who were excluded. So it is a construction, but it's a construction that works as a vision of where you want society to be in the absence of a better alternative vision. And I think for me, this is a story, the story of the kind of rise of the far right is as much the story of, on the one hand, the collapse of centrist liberal politics and this technocratic message that kept being kind of rehashed and revisited and delivered. And on the other hand, also the inadequate or the very weak alternative from a different, equally progressive tradition, but critical of capitalism, of globalization, of the market, and so on. So I think you're right, it is in a way a critique of ideas, but it's not so much the ideas in the abstract, it's more the way in which political institutions have delivered these ideas. And so, you know, freedom means free market freedom. Equality means just the equality of people who are within the nation state, and what happens to these other people out there, who cares? It's not our responsibility, it's someone else's responsibility. And I feel the only way forward is to actually take this seriously as a message, as a program, as a platform, and engage with the ideas rather than engage with saying this guy is crazy, this guy is crazy, this guy is corrupt, and so on. Because I think it's a trap if you think that you're undermining the project by undermining the individual people that happen to endorse that project.
Well, I have, as usually, I have a from the ground perspective, whereas Leah has the, you know, the overview. And as we were talking about Breivik, and that's the book that you know prepared for now. What is a search of ideas and a search of an ideology, and what is a search for belonging? And in his case, and I think in many neo-Nazis' case, is it of course it's an ideology of hatred, but it's also, when you look at the research of what kind of youngsters join a neo-Nazi party movement, and what kind of youngsters join a jihadi crowd, like we saw in the mid-2010s, it's very similar people. It's very often, it's, you know, that you come from unstable living conditions. I'm talking about young people. One common denominator is actually the lack of a father. Doesn't mean that if you don't have a father, you become a neo-Nazi or a jihadi if you're a Muslim, but it's a common denominator that's very strong. And many other factors of education and so on. So feeling weak, feeling humiliated makes you want to join something strong. And there we have Breivik. In his case, like, he's a chameleon, if you say that, you know, an animal that redresses himself all the time. So he started out but always wanting to be the winner and the strongest and the leader. And when that's your goal, you're doomed to fail if you're not a winner. So first he wants to become a best soccer player. Nobody remembers him on the soccer team. Then he wants to become a graffiti artist, because that was the thing of the day in the 90s. So he's like, but he's, as they say, he wants to be a king and he's just a toy. It was their words. Then he joins politics. So he joins the Progressive Party, which is the right-wing party in Norway, but still within parliamentarian boundaries. But, you know, anti-immigration, but also anti-tax. He joins them. He's not chosen. They don't like him. He's not a winner. And then he wants to be this. He joins the. You know, he wants to become rich. So he fails becoming rich. Had he become a billionaire back then, maybe he wouldn't have become a terrorist. So then, depressed, he moves into the internet and he becomes a World of Warcraft fighter for 2 years. He just like into that world, and he fails there too. He joins the dark web. He goes deeper and deeper into the dark webs. and he succeeds. He gets pals. They support him. He becomes more and more extreme. But in this milieu, they don't talk about violence. They talk about ideas. Because they know if they talk about violence and actions, they will be targeted. But it's safe space to talk about what to do with the Muslims if you don't do it yourself. So he somehow believes that ideologically he has a huge crowd. So he feels, he goes deeper and deeper into this, feels that if he commits the terror act that he's planning in his head, the Europe will be taken over by the neo-nationalists, so he will be released quickly. And he's writing this in his manifesto, like, he thinks the change will come first to France, so he thinks that his brothers in France are going to save him after. Maybe he will spend a few years in prison before the whole of Europe is taken over by, by the far right. So it's also like how, for him, this ideology is also partly a place to belong, is wishful thinking, and believing that there is a much more, much stronger commitment from the others, and so he wants to become this far-right ideologue, but as we know, he never became that, because he is uncharismatic. He is not a leader. So, and as we know, he's still in prison, and he's probably gonna die in prison. So no, we don't believe that, do we? That the far right will take over Europe.
Hopefully, although the ideas that he promulgated are very much around us, whereas in 2011 they were really a fringe phenomenon, a brave phenomenon, so to say. Let me just still stay with the idea of freedom. So as I said, what we see in the book Free is this changes in vocabularies, basically various kinds of ideals, categories, concepts, they just disappear, they're just wiped off. Yet one remains, although with a kind of changed content, and that one is free. What does it mean to be free? Freedom. Whereas in One of Us, there appears, I mean, if you haven't read the book, please do. The book is really incredible. I mean, both are. Because there are many people appearing there. It's a book about Breivik, but it's also a book about people who were affected in various ways, but his deeds. And one Afghan father who was braving his two sons to leave Afghanistan says to his sons, in Europe, there is no war. There, democracy rules. And we could infer that he also says to them in some way, there you can be free, which probably in Afghanistan, at least at that point in time, you cannot. So what kind of freedom, as there are many kinds, as Free says to us in many ways, are we living today, and how much our whereabouts also impact on how we live the freedom? Freedoms.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the core ideas of Free was that there is this difference between, and this is where you started actually, this difference between freedom as an idea and freedom as an ideology. And this transition moment, which is where the ideology around freedom changes, but the commitment to this abstract idea seems to be the same. It's just that the categories are different. So you had the working classes, and now you have civil society. You had the party, and now you have the European Union, and all these different sort of replacements of categories, which to me suggests that the kind of freedom that we have now is also itself an ideology of freedom. Because for me, philosophically, freedom only makes sense in a relationship. So freedom is a kind of relation of responsibility. It's an idea that's deeply connected to also morality and moral agency. So you're not free to the extent that you do whatever you feel like. You're free to the extent that you take responsibility for your actions and you think about the impact that it will have on other people. COVID was a very good example of how we actually we made decisions in the name of freedom, but they were restrictive decisions for individuals, and yet it was in the name of this higher responsibility that we have in social relations. And somehow this didn't quite, there was this discussion, if you remember, around COVID about how this would change the way we thought about each other, we thought about society and so on. And actually COVID was over and it was back to business as usual. It's just that people were more affected by the pandemic, and so the sense of dissatisfaction and exclusion and marginalization increased. But it's not that our analysis of freedom changed or the ideology around freedom changed. So for me, the ideology around freedom is very much, on the one hand, this sort of what I call centrist liberal ideology, which is freedom is liberal institutions plus free markets. And then all the critiques around that are triggered or driven by concepts like corruption or individual failure or inability to deliver or to take responsibility for your own self. And so wherever you have poverty or marginalization, it's somehow the fault of the person rather than the fault of the system. So this very individualistic way of thinking about freedom as just a lack of restrictions and not really as a sense of joint responsibility. Or the right-wing one, which, as Åsne said, was much more sort of far-right and off the mainstream, but is increasingly becoming mainstream, which is it's the freedom of a particular community, and what happens to others doesn't matter. And I think the best example of that is the MAGA Make America Great Again. So what you do is you focus on your own country, you focus on your own community, you put all the efforts at cleaning it up, making sure that you get rid of the outsiders, that you make it as homogeneous as possible, and then hope that this will deliver some freedom. But expressively just for this group, not for anyone else. You don't take responsibility. In fact, you actively undermine international institutions or efforts to coordinate or to think about freedom beyond this particular communitarian relation. So you have, as I say, in Europe now, there's two main ideas. One is the sort of liberal centrist one, which is political freedom plus free markets, and the other one, which is the communitarian one, that is political community organic and anti-immigration as a result of that, or anti-outsider. And these are, I would say, both of them ideological and ideologically flawed, and also both of them not really freedom understood in this more moral responsibility sense.
Well, I think that freedom today, I remember when I came to Serbia the first time in 99 and 2000, you were under sanctions. I remember young people at the time, what did they want? They wanted most and all to travel, to study abroad, but they were not free to do that. And I think now with Europe is more, now if you're free to travel, you can study in other countries, but it's also like a division of classes. Like you have one class that, if, say in the US, or the 1% that, owns, is it 30% of the world, like free to have their own jets and, totally freedom. But what is the freedom of someone who's, tied to a low paid job and can't really move? And I think that probably, correct me if you disagree, but probably, not to brag about my country, and it's not because the ambassador is here from Norway, but it's probably the most free country in the world. And one thing is about nature, because we're not a cultural nation, we are a nature nation. And what the government is doing now is that people have put up fences down to the sea across Norway because they own the property. But then we have a right in Norway that nature is for everyone. So now, the rich people who have the, beach properties, and they're forced to take down the fences because this area is for everyone. People can't camp there and put up their tents, but they're allowed to walk there. So the freedom for that family to be able to go and swim alone, and people who working there have to go a big detour to swim or to pass. That's over. Is either fences are gone. Everyone can go there. Anyone can swim everywhere. I remember when I was in this area between LA and San Francisco. You walk in nature on the beach, and it's like fences, and you really have to go up on the highway. You actually need to have a car to move. So it's like, for me, and I'm not a philosopher, but I'm more like, on the ground people, like, what is the freedom? What is freedom for the individual? For Norway, for most Norwegians, freedom is be able to roam around everywhere. Of course, not inside people's gardens, but if they have large properties down to the sea, off with the fences. This is for everyone. We own this together.
To ask you whether you're too hot here, and would you like us to somehow move somewhere, especially you, Lea, because you don't have the glasses?
I'm used to it, it's fine.
Okay.
I'm not used to it, so I'm fine too.
Okay. I mean, we can spare that 1-2 minutes to do that if you would like it. So if you... We can, maybe to run away from the sun. Do you want to change?
I'm fine.
Okay, now we are moving to... I also remember that Lea was in Belgrade in 2018. It was not very hard to remember that because she was at my Institute of Philosophy and Social Theory, where she gave a lecture with a significant name. 11 Theses, you will remember who was talking about 11 Theses, on migration in the capitalist state. And what is also important, what also appears about the 1990s Albania is this, like the closed country opened its borders and people started to leave. And then Lea at some point says a very important thing also for the Serbians, as Åsne mentioned, like what is the right to leave if there is no right to stay? And how do we deal with this idea, which is very well known since, I don't know, the first resolution on refugees in 1952. In any case, my question to you is about immigration, and also what is interesting, Åsne describes how the immigration started basically by the end of 1980s and was then spreading in the 90s. So it's somehow overlapping with this opening of the Eastern Europe and the possibility to move. As well, we now know about the word remigration. It seems that Breivik was also talking precisely about that, even if he didn't use that precise word, but he was hailing himself as being the only one who is brave enough to say that now all of those immigrants have to be chucked out. So the issue of immigration is somehow related to all of what we talked thus far, but if you can share some more thoughts.
Yeah, well, for Breivik, it was like all immigrants with Muslim immigrants only, with more than, even if you have a Muslim grandfather, chucked out or killed. So it's extreme, but it's. I think that in Norway, of course, Breivik changed us all. It was a shock. We had to look at our values and how we deal with immigration and being a society. And I believe that all those, the empty words in speeches on National Day somehow of unity and togetherness, it's like they were filled with meaning. For firstly, of course, we're thinking, is that just now or does it last? And that's something we need to fight for. And I was just this week, I was at there was this band in a big rapper band in Norway called Karpe. And they are, it's two Muslims or two immigrants, and it's like it's by definition. And they sing in Norwegian. They sing about Norway. And about being an immigrant, they had 100,000 visitors on their concert. It's like by far, and it was the most touching experience actually. This feeling of, we are a nation that with different races and religions belonging. So it is something that, and of course also now I'm going actually to this Utøya, the camp, the labor camp for the first time during a camp, because they've started doing the summer camp again after the Breivik massacre, and that's also these young political parties that are definitely doing a lot to integrate and to be where the people are. So it's a constant fight on the bottom on up, where there's music, where there's politics, whether it's education and speaking to the neighbors. So yeah.
Yeah, I think for me this immigration question is actually one of the most important axes through which to think about the failures of contemporary politics, both on the right and on the sort of more progressive left. And it's also partly one of the reasons for why when people ask me, so what is your model of like the free society or the just society? And a lot of people, I think, go to the Nordic countries for an example. One of the reasons I resist this idea is exactly connected to, in particular, how social democratic parties now in Scandinavia, especially I just came from Denmark, talk about immigration, and the way in which the left has internalized these categories of the right, which reads political conflict as driven by identity or religious or cultural lines. Where in fact, I think the first question to ask about immigration is, number one, is it really about membership and culture and religion? Or is the kind of immigration that people worry about in Western liberal societies not asymmetric immigration? So immigration from one part of the world to another part of the world. So nobody worries about Canadians going to Australia and Germans going to the United States and so on and so forth. So the only kind of migration that we worry about is migration that comes from usually poor countries to rich countries. And it's driven by three things: war, financial disruption, or environmental disasters. And in all of these three things, there is no conversation in liberal European societies on what is the complicity of your own state in creating an international system that facilitates war, facilitates financial crisis, and facilitates environmental breakdown. And where, in fact, these right-wing parties are the first to dismantle even whatever there is of it, because their first project is to undermine international institutions, to undermine the European Union, to undermine the United Nations, to return to your make your country great again. All of which produces in the long run more migration of this kind. And therefore, for me, reading conflicts around migration as driven by religion or capacity to integrate or whatever just misses the fact that actually migration of the kind that is problematic is driven by vulnerability. And as it happens, most of central London is owned by Arab oligarchs. And nobody worries about, why do Arab oligarchs own half of London? What are they doing with their multiple wives? And why are they closing the shops when they need to buy 40 pairs of shoes for these women that you can't see? And so actually, nobody cares about them. They're like, yeah, sure, they're rich, they can do whatever they want. And therefore, to me, and actually, the only migrants that there is a war against are poor migrants and vulnerable migrants. And of course, then it's driven by identity, religion, culture, language integration. But it's very clear to me that there is a class dimension to this conflict. So for me, the greatest failure of social democratic countries, countries with a social democratic tradition, liberal, progressive, universalist European states, is just this buying into the reading of the right that says, look, the problem is identity, culture, religion, and not understanding that actually migration, when it's problematic, it's because of the kinds of things that liberal governments contribute to and are responsible for. So if you want to have an honest conversation around migration, you need to start from where does it come from? What is your country doing to prevent it? Rather than how can I close the border and how can I return to my values, my community, and so on. So there's a lot more to say. But for me, the first element of critique is to just see that the problem of migration is not the problem of membership. It's not the problem of belonging. It's not even movement, because we human beings have been free to move since they existed. We are animals that move around, that's just like all animals, actually. It's borders and the asymmetric nature of these border divisions and the contribution that they make to these asymmetries of wealth and power that then trigger migration of a certain kind. So if you don't have this conversation that is longer and more complicated, but that is necessary and that requires you to have a different category of the entire apparatus, you will never win with the right. And so you will always end up, to go back to your remigration question, you will always end up with a discourse where they start with, well, of course we need to get rid of all the rapists, and everyone says, yeah, sure, why not? We need to get rid of the rapists. And then they go like, no, but now we got rid of the rapists and now it's just illegal migrants, whether they raped or not. So then, okay, everyone says, yeah, of course they're illegal migrants, they're breaking the law. Then you can't win with that because migration continues, because nothing has been solved. So the problem has not been solved at the source. And then they go, well, maybe we can do people who are residents. No, they don't have citizenship. So you start with this disenfranchisement. Okay, you don't have citizenship, you go. They get rid of that. then you're like, okay, but who is a citizen but has only been a citizen for 10 years? Then you go to the next one. And this is exactly, and this I will really end here because I could talk for hours on this topic, but this is exactly when you think about this interwar period in the 1930s and the rise of Nazism, this is exactly how the war against, for example, Jewish background people started in Europe in 1920s, 1930s. There's this escalation. The Second World War, the Holocaust, was just the last step of the process that had started 20 years before with first, we need to make sure that the Jews who are not integrated into liberal culture understand that they need to be integrated. Then it's like, well, but they're competing with the doctors and lawyers for access to the professions. And so then they start saying, well, we have to have quotas for French, say in France, this was the debate during the Popular Front years, we have to have quotas for French citizens and forget about Jewish people who are immigrants from Germany, for example, because they've been kicked out by the Nazis. And then it builds, and then you end up with a whole Europe where it doesn't matter what you have done, so long as your surname is Levi and you got a little star, then you go to a concentration camp. And I worry that the process that is going on now in Europe, that starts with rapists and illegal migrants and then so on, will end up with anyone who's called Mohammed and Abdallah will end up in a concentration camp.
Unfortunately, the time passes fast, and as we have to finish at the moment when we have to finish, I will have just 2 questions now, and then I will open the floor to the audience, so prepare your questions if you have them. I didn't want to stay only with Breivik. I wanted to have some also spotlight on the last book by Åsne, which is called Ufred, and is translated as non-peace, unpeace, or nemir in our language, which is also nice because it's unsettled and anxious, and all of that goes together. In the 1990s, people in Belgrade and elsewhere in Serbia also knew this state of being in war, but not being in war at the same time. And there was also what you called this kind of learned indifference, which was growing with the years and it has now reached absolutely abominable heights. So I would like you to tell us a little bit more about this state of non-war in Russia. But then I also want to bring us to some maybe pacifism question, I don't know, anti-militarism question. In one interview that I was listening with Farida Kurbangaleva, Åsne said that every soldier in Russia has the possibility to say no to the bearing of arms. And then I remembered very similar words coming from Judith Butler in the spring of 22, when Butler kind of hoped that the Russian soldiers are just going to lay down their arms and stop the war, which is very much in line with the idea of non-violence philosophy that they are promulgating. But the reaction of the Ukrainian feminists, and also not just Ukrainian feminists, was very strong to that, and generally to any kind of pacifist ideas at the time, also this time. So I wonder, what happened with our various visions of peace? Can we think of peace only during the peacetime, but when there is the rattling of arms, then we are all becoming somehow militarist again, or for the first time? Is war or ufred the only option that we have? Also bearing in mind, now that we talked about immigration, also bearing in mind that in Serbia we are having at the moment the largest community of the Russian emigres from Putin's regime. So the question is there only way to say no to war that is not to fled from it, basically? So there's many questions about war and peace, but you can choose your paths.
Well, one perspective is also that, the people who fled the war also helped Putin. Had they all stayed in Russia and protested and, put up if not a military fight, that's one perspective. It's the fact that it was very easy to leave. Anyone who wanted could just go, and almost 1 million people did since the full-scale invasion in 2022. So the title, Ufred, Nemir, Unpeace, is also because the World War is not allowed to say. When it comes to the war in Ukraine, you can use the word war in Russia when you talk about the Napoleon Wars or the Second World War. but you can be put in prison if you use it on the war in Ukraine. So when that law came, the law came 2 weeks after the new censorship laws came 2 weeks after the full-scale invasion, so in the beginning of March 22. And then the headline on the front page of the Novaya Gazeta, which is the oppositional paper in Russia, it was, "They still haven't forbidden the word peace." And then inside there were blank pages. But on the back side, because as you know, in this country and definitely in the Soviet Union, there's also like how they use humor and writing between the lines. There was this cartoon of a big Russian bear, you know, reading a book, and it's a very famous book by Leo Tolstoy, and it was scribbled out, the first word, and so he was reading "and peace." And then with like handmade letter, it was like, "The full-scale invasion and peace," that this Russian bear is reading. So that's like those kind of going behind the censorship and not breaking a law. This is not unallowed. So the atmosphere that you mentioned, that you recognize from Belgrade when the war is raging further south, that's the same in Moscow, St. Petersburg, big cities. It's changed a little bit the last few months because of the consequences that are now reaching Russia through Ukrainian drones, targeting specifically, you know, oil installations and so on. So there's a restriction on gasoline. People can only fill their 15 to 20 liters. There's no gasoline for the garbage trucks, so the city starts to smell. There's a fear of drones, of course, and then Putin has shut down partly the internet because of drones navigation. So this is starting to target the indifferent people, you know, the learned indifference. That is a term that is used not just on Putin's regime, but it's like through the generation. It's always better for you to bow your head, to follow, to be in line, and that goes very well with the theme of this festival, disobedience. It always pays off to be obedient, you know, then you will have a longer life and a better life and a life outside of prison. So whether this is waking up the Russian population, I actually doubt it, but still the war or the unpeace is growing on them. But before that, so until the last few months, like you go in the big cities, restaurants are full, the theater full. It's still impossible to get a ticket for the Bolshoi Ballet. You know, it's the stores are. IKEA has been switched over to a Turkish furniture brand. H&M has switched over to also Turkish, actually. Same kind of, you know, Zara, that kind of, you know, nice clothing for young people, low cost. So it's like they lived almost without noticing the war. But your question about pacifism was that is like I live in a country that is arming up, and Europe is arming up, and it feels like there's a lot of talk about preparing for the war, very little about preparing for a new peace when that comes. So the money spent now on arming Europe is you know, it's really costing on behalf of other costs. So that is yeah, that's a political decision, and it's do we actively, that's a big question, do we actively also then kind of how do you say, like you know, there's a reciprocal movement. Are we then also rearming Russia against us because we're moving our military installations closer to the Russian border? We have now what do you call it, when they have rehearsals. We used to never have them close to the Russian border that we share. Now we do have them closer to the Russian border, and so on. So that is, it's definitely not a time for pacifism. Where's the peace movement now? Like in the 60s, and you told about my leftist father going back to him, he was like, you know, in the 60s, we knew so much about nuclear weapons. We studied them, we had clubs, we were like, the regular person knew so much. And now suddenly, just like that, our Prime Minister went to Paris and just joined this umbrella of nuclear without any discussions. So it's, I think like where I think we need a peace movement. We don't have it in Europe right now, and it's because of Russia. It seems like it's once you're a peace activist, you're gonna ask, oh, you run Putin's errand. So I think we need to detangle that situation a little bit, and also talk about peace, not just arming ourselves to the teeth.
Yeah, I completely agree with Åsne on this, especially these last words. And I would say the only thing I would add to her analysis, I think she knows Russia a lot more than me, so maybe I talk a bit more about the European side, is if you want no war, you have to ask for no war. And so this idea that if you want peace, prepare for war, it's complete bullshit in general. Historically, it doesn't work like that. The more you arm, the more likely you make it to have a war, and then you have a war, you have this total destruction, and then you have compromise. So every war ends with a compromise. There is no total victory from either side, and certainly in nuclear times, there can be no total victory which doesn't involve destroying half humanity. So this idea that you can actually want and build peace and bring peace by rearming is a complete logical contradiction to begin with, but also actually a social, a political contradiction, because historically, every time there has been an arms race, there has been also a war. And the only times where war was averted is when there was diplomacy working to reduce, for example, nuclear weapons, to write these non-proliferation agreements, to write agreements against biological and use of chemical weapons, and so all of which is being unraveled now. So all of these agreements that we did have in the 70s and 80s are all slowly being undermined, and the race is very much in the other direction. The only other thing I would say vis-a-vis the sort of European, the way the discourse plays in Europe, is that again there is this kind of very naive belief by European elites that the threat to Europe peace is at the border with Russia. And what they don't reflect on is the fact that actually the threat to Europe is first not Russia, it's the clique and the elite around Putin, so a particular way of thinking about Russian society, which it's not even conducive to one individual, but it's a project that is an ethno-national project of Russian supremacy, which is very much incidentally also the project of Trump, the project of Meloni, the project of the Orban people, and the project of Le Pen. And so this ethno-national supremacy reading is not just at the border with Europe, it's inside the European capitals, because in all these European states you have far-right parties about to become government, whether it's AfD, whether it's Marine Le Pen. And so this thought that you can actually solve the problem by solving the war with Russia, when the problem is that Putin is inside your borders, and this logic of patriotism and rearmament that is so destructive that in any historical context, when you have this aggressive patriotism, there is always war. It culminates in war. War is a kind of last expression of patriotism. That's where you show it in the end. When you've done all your work against the migrants and against the minorities and so, what is left to you? It's just going to war to fight for your country. And this becomes the paradigm of heroism. And if you notice, Giorgia Meloni, what does she do now? She goes to meetings with soldiers and generals and talks about valore and onore and coraggio and so on, all these kind of values that are military values. So if you don't have a discourse in society that says, look, the problem isn't just the threat at the border, it's the discourse of remilitarization combined with this ultra-aggressive nationalist patriotism in your own countries that is a threat to peace, I don't really see how any move towards rearming Europe will actually bring peace.
This is for the applause. Thank you very much, both of you, for this. I loved the answers. I hope you too. So I will in fact finish, although there is more questions on my part, but I will finish with the question about the protests. At the moment in Albania there is the Flamingo Revolution, and somehow it's also very much related to our disobedience common theme of the festival. But also in Serbia there is like 20 months of protests that had their various phases. Now they are in some different phase than they were last year, but still, I mean, we have protests. What do you think about them? Also because now that we talked for an hour about various things, they somehow do not fall within the category of the coraggio and the other, which is nice. For a first time, maybe, you know, the Serbians and the Albanians are kind of the beacon of hope and doing something very different and possibly likable by the left in the other parts of the world. So this is my larger part of the question. And the other one, both of you are in this or that way related to this part of the world. Have you been encountering news about what was going on in Serbia since basically the December of 24? So we are almost, I mean, very close to 2 years to that. And I'm asking this precisely because whenever I travel and talk to people, basically everyone says to me, well, I don't know, it's not in my news, I have no clue what is going on. So somehow it seems to me now that the Flamingo Revolution really is covering a lot of news, and the similar thing did not happen with the student protests.
Maybe I'll start because I'll be short. I'm very much looking forward to hearing Lea's view on the Albanian protest, which are amazing. When it comes to, and that have been covered, when it comes to the Serbian protest, it's being covered, but with every protest that drags on, it loses the interest because it's not really something new. And I haven't really grasped it myself, because you have these students, they sacrifice their education, they don't go to their studies because of corruption, because of the roof that fell down, and of course a lot of other issues. But it's not really, if that was part of the question, it's not really something that, it's drowning in everything that's happening now with, you know, with the war, with Trump in particular, with China. So on a European perspective, I don't think many people know about it. So I'll just end there and leave the floor to Lea.
Yeah, so the focus on Albanian protests was helped by the attention to the Trump family. And so the fact that this was triggered by a response to a Kushner-related development, which I think was going on in Serbia. There was a kind of Kushner element in Serbia as well, but I think it wasn't at the right political momentum. And so it didn't catch the attention of the media because it didn't coincide with this response to Trump and this antagonizing of Europe and the US. And so there's all these like internal political conflicts within Europe and the United States that you have to think about that definitely draws attention to the protests. So maybe I start with something a bit more pessimistic, and then I'll end on a more uplifting note. So the pessimistic part is there is a character in my new book, that this is the one that's not out in Serbia yet, who says, and I think this applies to both the Albanians and the Serbians in different measure, who says, you know, dear boy, he's talking to his son, there are some nations out there who make history. We are not one of them. History, he says, history to us is made. And I think in the spirit of this history to us is made, what makes me somewhat pessimistic about this protest, which I had been following for a long time in Serbia and was very positively surprised to see that at least there was an inspiring effect in Albania, and the Albanian protest follows very much the same pattern as the Serbian one. It's spontaneous, it's refusing to have a leader, it's much more kind of from the ground and bottom up and so on, and also has these features of anti-elitist, anti-system, to some extent also an effort to recover democracy from this oligarchic capture of our politics, which is the same. But it's also, and I don't know if this is the case in Serbia, but in Albania, when I look at the protests, I see 50 shades of nationalism. And including in the social democratic progressive version, but it's still versions of nationalism, meaning that there is a kind of naive hope, and this is where I said I'm a bit more pessimistic, there is a naive hope that these protests will actually make your own history. And of course they won't, because these are small countries caught in geopolitical conflicts much larger than them, that depend on these great powers and on the politics of the great powers for their development. So whoever comes to power will eventually have to make similar compromises with capital, with investors, with donors, with the Trump, with the EU, with Russia, with China, with you name it. So what is the hope? And this is what I think now, to end on a more optimistic note, the hope is that these protests, who don't take yet this kind of exclusionary anti-immigration form, because they can't, that they do, these anti-system forces that are in core Western Europe are captured by the right. Here it's much more genuine civil society, and there is more, I think, progressive orientation. So for me, the hope is that just as there is a contagion effect between Serbia and Albania, there will also be a contagion effect vis-à-vis Italy and other sort of states in Europe, where you can have a civil society movement that rises against the system. And there you have much more of a chance of actually changing the system, because you need coordination between lots of different states and you need a movement in Europe that can... So I think it's really important that these protests are there, because they signal to the elites that people, actually, they don't always take this shit. Sometimes you just stand up for something, and even if it's hopeless, even if you're very small, even if it's a small country, even if it's you against the Trump family, the EU, whatever, this is a sign of hope for me, that, and the sense that there is still this belief in civic activism. But in terms of outcome, I don't think I am that hopeful without a more general mobilization of civil society or of these progressive actors in the continent, at least the continent more broadly.
I think it was a very, very, very nice conversation. Now it's your time. We have 15 minutes more, so if there is a question, if you don't want to say it in English, I can translate it into English, so please.
Mogu ja.
Hello, my name is Miloš. Thank you for a very nice discussion. I have one question for Åsne. If she can explain to us, maybe to the audience, since the next topic and next discussion is about from Srebrenica to Gaza. And if you can explain to us what Breivik said at his trial and who are his inspires. Since two of the guys convicted for genocide in Srebrenica were his inspires. Thank you.
Yes, so Breivik is he's like he says he has a doctor degree because he's counted the hours reading Wikipedia and other sources and divided up like day by day, and he's realized that he has a doctor degree actually. And that's how he does his research, and he seems also to be very often forgetting. So he doesn't really mention names, but he mentions Serbia a lot as an inspiration. But it's not like, I don't even think he mentions Mladic or Karadzic by names, but he has this reference group or inspirational group, or what do you call it, like a field attack group with him, lots of Serbians and some other nationalities. So it's more like he's using or abusing, absolutely abusing your nationality, but of course based in some atrocities and some terrible military war criminals. But it's the police was, I mean, because they went into everything he wrote. Does this group exist? Like, he's killed 77 people. He must be a team. That's what the police went out to think. Like, there must be, he can't be alone on this. Like, how is it possible? How many people were on the island? How many, what's the next attack coming up? And so they went into everything he said, and that they were seriously researching this group. And they ended up, this is a fantasy group. He has no connections to any Serbs. So it's taking out the Serbian nationalist leaders because they killed Muslims in Srebrenica. That's his dream. He's on was on a crusade on killing Muslims. So it's that's the only known connection. I mean, no connection to Serbia apart from in his head.
Nora will be happy to
While we're
pass the
waiting,
mic.
I can say one thing about protest in Serbia, because I remember I was there. Was it like October 1st, 2000? When was it? October 5th, 2000?
October 5th.
When, October 5th, right? When it was as you all know, Lea wasn't here to tell her, like there've been protests for years against Milosevic. But that date, it was the feeling and the decision by so many Serbians. We're going to the square in front of the parliament or presidential palace. We're not leaving until Milosevic is gone. I remember they came with trucks, they came with tractors, the farmers, the buses, the students filling up. Police tried with tear gas. By the afternoon, Milosevic was gone. Because it was just so many people. How many people were there? 1 million? Half a million?
No, now we think it was. Am I heard? Yeah. Now we think that there were less people than on various other occasions
Really?
now organized by the student movements.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. But anyway, it was like, why did that movement succeed for that cause? You know, it's just interesting, the intention.
It's interesting. I think actually communism fell in Albania much more easily than the current government that is still there after 33 days of protests. It did not take 33 days of this kind of massive protest to get rid of communism.
Hi, thank you for the conversation. I'm from Switzerland, so a country that is within Europe but positions itself very much outside of Europe. So it was very inspiring to listen to you. And on this idea of the system, a capitalist system needs even more time to get tackled or is more resistant. I don't know, I feel like within my society there has been a cynicism, like within all people, no matter what kind of political color they have. And yeah, I was wondering, like, what would your position be or a perspective on how to tackle that cynicism? Because I think all these notions of solidarity, freedom, all of that, it's kind of been hollowed out. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's a very interesting question also because you can see how from the perspective of a small country, like say Switzerland in this case, it's much more easy to be complicit with a system that you can't change anyway. So you can decide to become like communist Albania that goes against the whole world, and then you know where that isolation ends up, and it's not a good place either. And there you understand that there are these constraints, that there are the constraints of transnational capital, and so what else can you do other than just comply, and therefore in complying become complicit, and so you end up contributing to the reproduction of this same system. And Switzerland is a very good example of a country that benefits actually from capitalism in its core features. But I think the best story I've heard about this recently, about what to do with this cynical stance, was actually reading an article from a Hungarian friend of mine after the Hungarian election. And it was an article, you can all read it because it's really interesting. It was published in the Los Angeles Review of Books. My friend is called Balázs Trencsényi. And he said something like, he started with this anecdote. He says, the frog, when it's boiling, it doesn't realize that it's burning until it's too late to jump from the pan. And so he said that actually what helped build this movement in Hungary, where it seemed impossible to get rid of Orban because of how much power he had entrenched, how much of the parts of the state he had captured, and the courts and the core institutions and the capital business interests were all complicit in upholding this government. And he said that little by little, over the course of the years, it's not that there was one thing that changed it. It's that sometimes there was a teacher who wouldn't change the syllabus when he was told to not change the syllabus. Sometimes it was an NGO that people kept funding from the ground, even though it looked like, what is the point of funding? It's lost cause anyway, they will be shut down. And so there were these like everyday acts of resistance that anyone can engage with in their work. You're a writer, you write, you're a publisher, you publish certain books, you're a journalist, you decide to cover events in one way rather than another. You're a politician, you hold up this stance and you protect these interests rather than these other interests. You're a lawyer, you're an economist, you're a doctor, anyone in their own professions, can do something of this kind that is not by itself going to change the regime, but it will bring it to this point where he said, and then this is why he ended up with this wonderful, I thought was a wonderful sentence, which said, "Frogs of the world unite."
Well, unfortunately, we have to stop here. Thank you so much for this, like, super passionate, super political, super thoughtful talk. I was thinking to end with the question, with the reference to Hannah Arendt's. There are no dangerous thoughts. Thinking itself is dangerous, and I think that we saw that in practice. We do not need like additional thoughts on that. This is what we had. Thank you so much.